Why did the room go so quiet when she pulled her sleeve back down? It had been nothing, just a glimpse. A faint line of black ink along her wrist, faded, almost forgettable. But in the cruel fluorescent light of the barracks it became a target. "Looks like one of those stickers you buy from a grocery store machine," Garrett Lawson sneered. His voice carried across the room like a weapon, sharp, deliberate, meant to draw blood without leaving a mark. Travis Keller and Mason Price flanked him like shadows, feeding on his cruelty. They had made Sloan Mercer their target from the first day of training. To them, she didn't belong here. Not at the Naval Special Warfare Advanced Training Facility. Not in this experiment, this quiet, controversial program that dared to bring in candidates from unexpected places. And Sloan, she gave them nothing. No anger, no defense, no fire back, just silence, the kind that made men like Garrett rage even more. She adjusted her gear list, pen steady, eyes calm. Not a flicker of recognition at his insult. Not a sound of protest when Travis leaned close, voice dripping false concern. "Tell me, Sloan, did you get that thing at a strip mall parlor? Buy one, get one free with your oil change." Even Mason, the quietest of the three, joined in, not with words, but with the slow, careful way he positioned himself just close enough to overhear whatever she might say. He was always collecting things. Words, reactions, weaknesses. But Sloan gave him nothing. She simply pulled her sleeve down, kept writing, kept breathing, kept being the ghost they couldn't touch. For 3 weeks this was her rhythm. To them it looked like submission. To her it was strategy. She had learned long ago some battles are traps, fights meant to expose, not resolve. Still the whispers grew, diversity hire, civilian mechanic, dead weight, words designed to sink deep to stick. And yet when the time came to move, Sloan moved. The obstacle course, weapons familiarization, tactical drills. She didn't explode out of the gate like others did. She didn't shout or flex or fight for attention. Instead, she studied each challenge the way someone studies a map, angles, distances, timing. She ran not like an athlete but like a machine built for endurance. Every motion measured, efficient, stripped of anything unnecessary. By the end, she wasn't first, but she wasn't last, third fastest, and most telling of all, she barely looked winded. "Lucky run," Travis muttered to anyone who'd listen. Somebody must have drawn her a map. But Dr. Elena Vasquez, watching from the sideline, noticed something else. The way Sloane's breathing slowed almost instantly. The way her body recovered like it had done this 1,000 times before. Interesting, Vasquez thought, very interesting. Later, during weapons testing, the suspicions deepened. They handed her an M4, expecting hesitation, expecting nerves. Instead, Sloane's hands moved like memory. She field-stripped and reassembled it with an ease that stopped even the senior armorer in his tracks. Petty Officer Blake had seen thousands of candidates. He knew the difference between competence and instinct. Her sight alignment perfect, trigger squeeze steady, breathing automatic. "Where'd you train?" he asked quietly, almost cautiously. Sloane's eyes didn't lift. "Various places." And that was all. Blake nodded, but inside something shifted. People who dodged questions usually had reasons. The good ones never bragged. They didn't have to. Mason noticed too. He always noticed. Later, when the group broke, he sidled up with that false smile. "Impressive shooting," he said. "You'll have to tell me what civilian contractor teaches tactical firing like that. Might sign up myself." Sloan kept cleaning her weapon, rag sliding across cold steel. "Standard contractor requirements." Right, Mason smiled, but his eyes narrowed. He'd file that away. Everything about her didn't add up. But that night, when she lay in the narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling, Sloan wasn't thinking about Mason or Garrett or Travis. She thought about silence, about how silence had kept her alive before, how it might be the only thing that could keep her alive again. Because the truth wasn't theirs to know, not yet. The next morning, the real test began. Advanced navigation. Pre-dawn, the teams assembled in the coastal hills. Their orders: reach checkpoints on time, undetected, moving through terrain where every shadow could hide an evaluator waiting to fail them. Sloane's stomach tightened when she saw her assignment. Garrett, Travis, Mason, all three on her team. Coincidence? No, training programs loved this kind of tension. Throw oil on fire and watch who burns. Garrett, of course, seized command without asking. I'm point, Travis rear, Mason comms, Mercer you carry water, try not to slow us down. Sloane didn't argue, she never argued. She shouldered the weight. Let them think what they wanted. Let them underestimate her. That too was a weapon. 2 miles in, the cracks appeared. Garrett led them straight onto a ridge line, silhouetted against the gray morning sky. Exposed, vulnerable. We're sitting ducks, Travis hissed. Need cover now. But Sloane was already moving, quiet, fluid, toward the draw below. 200 meters this way, she said evenly. Dead ground. Concealment all the way to the checkpoint. Garrett bristled, his authority challenged, but Mason, practical enough to feel fear, snapped. Whatever, get us off the skyline. And so they followed her. And when the draw led exactly where she promised, when it saved them minutes and left them invisible to evaluators, none of them spoke. But the air changed. Lucky guess, Travis muttered. But Mason's eyes lingered, too sharp, too calculating. Later at the river, the real test came. Garrett chose the obvious crossing point. Shallow, direct, exposed. Sloane had studied it in silence. She knew the truth before they stepped into the water. This was a trap. And then chaos. Simulated gunfire from both banks. Evaluators opening fire from overwatch positions. The water churned around their legs, panic rising in Garrett's voice. That's when Sloane's mask cracked, not to show fear but command. Smoke now, she barked. Travis, suppress left. Mason, dead ground, 10 o'clock. Garrett, move with Mason, set covering fire. Her voice cut like a blade through panic, and somehow they obeyed. Grenades hissed, smoke spread. They shifted, moved, flowed, no longer 3 men and a mechanic but a unit. And by the end they had broken free. Evaluators called it outstanding tactical response. Textbook. But everyone knew the truth. It was Garrett, it was Travis, it wasn't Mason. It was her. That night, as the others bragged in whispers about survival, Mason studied her again. His suspicion sharpened to certainty. Nobody gets that good from civilian contractor work. Nobody. She was hiding something, and he would find it. But Sloane, she only sat quietly on her bunk, rolling her sleeve back down, covering the tattoo, covering the story no one here was ready to hear. Because some truths weren't hers to tell, not yet. And so the silence stretched on. Why did the doctor's eyes linger, just a second too long, on the scars along her shoulder? Sloane sat in the sterile light of the medical wing, her uniform crisp, her expression unreadable. To anyone else, this was just another routine exam. But to Dr. Elena Vasquez, it was something else entirely. She had seen soldiers broken in combat. She had studied their bodies, their recovery, their wounds. And the marks on Sloane's frame didn't read like the scars of an aircraft mechanic. They read like survival. This pattern here, Vasquez spoke clinically, running a finger a respectful inch above Sloane's skin. It looks surgical, military procedure, ballistic trauma, not industrial accident. Can you explain? Sloane's eyes stayed steady. Her answer carried no hesitation, no nervousness. Training mishap, equipment failure. The phrasing was deliberate. Soldiers said training mishap. Civilians said workplace accident. Vasquez heard the difference. But she didn't press. Not yet. She simply wrote in her notes, her pen scratching across the page. Clean bill of health, fit for duty. And yet when Sloane left, Vasquez stayed at her desk a long while, her mind churning. Something about this woman did not fit. Later, the 3 men gathered in their dorm like vultures. Garrett stretched his thick arms behind his head, smirking. Travis leaned against the bunk with his usual quiet menace. Mason, the thinker, tapped his fingers on the desk, eyes calculating. "She's hiding something," Mason said finally, breaking the silence. Travis tilted his head. "Stolen valor, maybe. Claims she was a contractor, but she's trained like an operator." Garrett cracked his knuckles, smiling in that cruel, satisfied way. "Then we dig, push her, hard enough, and either she cracks or she exposes herself. Either way, she's out." The plan was simple, too simple, but Sloan was in their crosshairs and they weren't going to let go. Meanwhile, Sloan carried her silence like armor. In training, she was flawless. She scaled walls, crawled through mud, ran miles without faltering. But it wasn't the speed that caught eyes. It was the calm. The way she didn't waste energy, didn't stumble, didn't let frustration leak through. She performed with the precision of someone who had been here before. Only she hadn't, not officially. And that was the problem. The instructors noticed. Captain Rodriguez, his face weathered by decades of service, watched her with suspicion that he couldn't explain. She moved like a veteran, but her file read like a mechanic's resume. Something didn't match. One morning, Sloan found herself staring at a river again. This time, it wasn't part of training. She had been given a rare hour off and she wandered to the edge of the grounds, where the coastal water ran dark and steady. The wind cut across her face, sharp, salty, alive. And for the first time in weeks, she let herself remember. The crash, the sound of fire in the night, the voices on comms fading one by one, the tattoo etched into her wrist that burned like a brand every time she thought of them, the coordinates, the numbers, the silent oath. She rubbed her sleeve down over it again, covering it, always covering it. Brooks, someone had called her once. Not Sloan, not mechanic, Brooks, her real name, her real unit. But that part of her life was supposed to be gone, buried, classified. So why did it ache now here, when she was supposed to be just another trainee? Back in the dorms, Mason was busy with a different kind of preparation. He wasn't as strong as Garrett, not as intimidating as Travis, but Mason had patience and knowledge. He knew the system, knew how records worked, how evidence was kept, how small manipulations could grow into storms. That night he slipped a small device into Sloan's gear bag. Sleek, black, military grade. A recorder. The kind that, if discovered, would look like surveillance. Unauthorized. A violation so serious it could end her career before it even began. The next morning the trap sprang. "Whose bag?" Senior Chief Patterson's voice cut through the line of trainees. He held the device high for all to see, his face a mask of authority. Sloan's heart sank as she recognized it, not because she had planted it, but because she knew exactly what it looked like. "Mine, Senior Chief." Her voice was steady, unflinching. Patterson studied her, care to explain. Her eyes lowered for the briefest moment, then returned to him. "No explanation, Senior Chief. Responsibility is mine." Gasps rippled quietly through the line. Even Patterson seemed caught off guard. She wasn't denying it, wasn't fighting back. She was accepting the hit. That was the soldier in her, the old soldier. You carried the weight even when it wasn't yours. But to Garrett, Travis, and Mason, it was victory. Sweet, simple victory. They exchanged the kind of looks that meant she's done. By the afternoon, Sloan stood in Captain Rodriguez's office. Sunlight cut across the desk, shadows stretching like prison bars on the floor. Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, the recorder on the table between them. "This is serious," he said. His voice wasn't angry, it was disappointed. "Unauthorized surveillance undermines everything we're trying to build here, and from someone with your performance record, it's especially disheartening." Sloan stood at attention. "I understand, sir. I accept full responsibility." Rodriguez studied her, his eyes narrowing. She wasn't nervous, not defiant either, just composed, too composed. Finally, he leaned forward. "Is there anything about your background, Anything relevant to this investigation that you'd like to share?" Silence filled the room. Sloane's lips parted, then closed again. Her answer came soft, heavy. "Some truths aren't mine to tell, sir." Rodriguez exhaled slowly. Something about those words pierced him. He didn't know what, but he knew this. Something wasn't right. He picked up his phone the moment she left and made a call. The background check he had already ordered was about to accelerate. But for Sloan, the wait was immediate. She returned to her quarters, her few belongings already gathered in her duffel. Garrett stood at the doorway, smug, Travis beside him, arms folded, Mason's eyes gleaming with cold satisfaction. "Finally giving up, huh?" Garrett said. Each word dripped triumph. "Guess the Navy doesn't need mechanics pretending to be operators after all." Sloan didn't turn, didn't answer. She just kept folding, kept packing. And then it happened, the smallest moment. A sleeve slipped, a tattoo flashed. Commander Hayes was walking past. He barely noticed the mocking voices, barely heard Garrett's laughter, but he saw the ink. Black, faded, unmistakable. The phone dropped from his hand, clattering to the concrete floor. His face went pale. His lips whispered words no one else understood. "We've been looking for someone like you for 18 months. The room froze. Garrett's grin faltered. Travis's arms loosened. Mason's jaw clenched. Sloan turned slowly, her gray eyes meeting Hayes's. Silent, steady, waiting. "Commander," she said softly. "Nothing more, nothing less." Hayes bent, retrieved his phone with trembling hands. His voice, when it came, was thunder. "Brooks, my office now." And just like that, everything shifted. The girl they had mocked, the ghost they had tried to erase, the mechanic they thought they'd broken. She wasn't who they thought at all. Not even close. Why did Commander Hayes's hands tremble as he closed the office door behind her? Sloan stood at attention, duffel at her side, eyes forward. The same calm composure she carried everywhere. But this time, it wasn't enough to mask the air in the room. Hayes wasn't looking at her as a trainee. He was looking at her like a ghost that had suddenly walked through his doorway. Dr. Vasquez was already waiting, files stacked on Hayes's desk. Thick folders, pages creased, the kind of paperwork that rarely belonged to simple mechanics. She gave Sloan a nod, professional, reserved, but heavy with something else. Recognition. Hayes didn't sit, he paced. A commander used to absolute control, now rattled by something he couldn't ignore. His voice cracked once before he steadied it. "Where did you get that tattoo?" Sloan's sleeve covered it again. She didn't glance down. "It's personal, sir." "It's more than personal," Hayes snapped, his mask of authority breaking. His eyes narrowed. "Those markings, those aren't decorative. Those are coordinates, unit designation, identification protocols for operators declared missing in action. I know, because I signed off on the reports." The silence that followed was crushing. Sloan exhaled slowly, her lips pressed into a line. "With respect, sir, I'm not at liberty." "Not at liberty," Hayes cut in. "You've been living under our noses for months. 18 months we've been searching. 18 months and here you are in a training program you shouldn't even qualify for. Explain that." Her gaze shifted just slightly to the floor. "I was told to disappear." Dr. Vasquez leaned forward. Her voice was calm, softer than Hayes's, but edged with curiosity. "Disappear? Sloan, or should I say Brooks?" The name hit the air like a detonation. Garrett, Mason, Travis, if they'd been in the room, the sound alone would have cracked their arrogance in half. But here, in Hayes's office, it was just the three of them. The commander, the doctor, and the woman who had been hiding in plain sight. Hayes pulled the file toward him, flipping pages. Blackbird 77, classified counterintelligence op, Gulf region, declared lost with all hands, no survivors. He stopped, eyes sharp. "And yet here you are." Sloan's chest tightened. The words dragged her back, to sand, to fire, to screaming voices on broken radios. She shut her eyes just for a second, then opened them again. Steady, always steady. I was separated, she said simply. Extraction compromised. My team didn't make it out. Her voice carried no tremor, no visible grief, but Dr. Vasquez, with her trained ear, caught the catch in her breathing, the way survivors always spoke when the ghosts pressed too close. Hayes slammed the file shut. Do you understand what this means? You've been listed as dead, buried in records, your existence erased. And now you show up here under a false file in a program that isn't meant for ghosts. Finally, Sloan met his eyes, calm, defiant even. I didn't put myself here, sir. That stopped him. For a moment, Hayes's anger ebbed into something colder. Then who did? She didn't answer, couldn't answer. Some truths weren't hers to tell. She learned that the hard way. The silence stretched until Vasquez slid a document across the desk. Her medical records. Her voice was firm. Look, scarring patterns, recovery rates, surgical work done in the field, not civilian, not contractor, military and recent. Hayes scanned the pages. The evidence screamed louder than Sloan ever would. Scars across her shoulder, fragment wounds along her leg, procedures only ever done in combat zones. Why hide it? Vasquez asked gently. Why live like this? You had every right to return, to be recognized, to grieve your team publicly. Sloan's jaw tightened, because recognition kills the living. The words dropped like stone into water. Neither officer spoke. Hayes's packing slowed, his face clouded. Finally, he asked the question no one had dared. Who gave the order? Sloan didn't flinch. That's classified. Hayes slammed his fist onto the desk, voice hard as steel. Don't play games with me, Brooks. I buried 12 names 18 months ago, 12 operators gone, and now I find out one of them lived. You think you can hide behind classified? Her voice softened, but the steel in it was unmistakable. I didn't survive because of my skill, Commander. I survived because they bought me that chance. Every second I've lived since is their sacrifice echoing. That's why I hide. For the first time, Hayes stopped speaking. His anger drained, replaced by something heavier. Respect. Vasquez closed the file. Commander, if I may, whatever she's carrying, it's killing her quietly. She's hiding more than just her name. She's hiding the guilt. That tattoo on her wrist isn't decoration. It's memory. It's survival written in ink. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full. Full of the weight of what had been said and what hadn't. Finally, Hayes sank into his chair, the fight leaving his shoulders. Blackbird 77, he muttered. Dead men walking, and one woman who refused to die. He lifted his eyes again. You understand this isn't just about you anymore. If you're here, training under a false identity, then either someone placed you or someone failed to protect you, and I intend to find out which. Sloan straightened her shoulders. With respect, sir, do what you must. My record speaks for itself. Your record, Hayes shot back, is a tombstone, and yet here you stand. The words carried no accusation now, only awe. Vasquez leaned closer to Hayes, her tone low. Commander, if she really is who we think, then the men mocking her, the ones who planted that recorder, they've been tormenting a decorated operator. That's not harassment. That's a violation that could sink their careers. Hayes's jaw clenched. Then let's sink them. But Sloan shook her head. No, let them have their illusions a little longer. Some battles aren't worth fighting out loud. The line hung there, heavy, undeniable. Hayes studied her, trying to understand what kind of person could carry that kind of pain with such silence. But the truth was written all over her, in scars, in ink in her eyes. She wasn't a recruit. She wasn't a mechanic. She was a survivor. And the storm was only beginning. Because outside those walls, Garrett, Travis, and Mason still believed they'd won. They still believed she was finished. They didn't know the ground was already shifting beneath their feet. That night Sloan lay awake in her bunk, staring at the ceiling. She heard their whispers across the room. their laughter, the satisfaction in every cruel word. But she didn't move, didn't respond. Her mind was far away, in the desert, in the fire, in the screams of men who never came home. She pressed her sleeve tighter over the tattoo, the ink burning against her skin. A promise, a graveyard, a reminder. And she knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the pause before everything collapsed. Because the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of rising. And when it did, the silence she had carried would finally speak. Why did Garrett's grin fade so quickly when Captain Rodriguez walked back into the briefing room the next morning? The candidates were already lined up, tension thick in the air. Garrett, Travis, and Mason wore the smug expressions of men who believed they'd won. Sloan had been suspended, confined to quarters, her future dangling by a thread. To them, the game was over. But Rodriguez's face told a different story. He entered with measured steps, a folder tucked under his arm. The air shifted instantly, a silence that wasn't casual, the silence of soldiers who knew something serious was about to fall. "Gentlemen," Rodriguez said, his voice low but heavy, "we need to talk about truth." Garrett's smirk faltered. Travis's arms, always crossed, unfolded just a little. Mason alone stayed still, though his fingers tapped lightly against his thigh, a nervous tell he couldn't quite control. Rodriguez laid the folder on the desk. The sound was louder than it should have been, a thud that made hearts skip. "Yesterday," he began, "we discovered a device in candidate Mercer's gear, a serious violation, enough to end a career before it starts." But his eyes swept the room, cold and sharp. "We don't stop at appearances, we investigate." A murmur rippled through the line. Garrett's jaw tightened. Mason's face remained impassive. Rodriguez flipped the folder open. Photographs slid across the desk, grainy but clear. Security footage, hallway angles, the barracks captured in shadows. And there it was, Mason, crouched by Sloan's gear bag, slipping something inside. The silence that followed wasn't ordinary. It was heavy, suffocating, the kind of silence that broke men more than shouting ever could. Mason's face drained of color. "That's not," he began, but Rodriguez cut him off with a raised hand. "Don't insult me. Don't insult this program. You think we don't run surveillance in a facility like this? You think your clever little scheme wouldn't be seen?" Travis's head snapped toward Mason, betrayal flashing across his face. Garrett's smirk was gone now, replaced by something sour, fear. Rodriguez leaned forward. 3 weeks. 3 weeks of targeted harassment. 3 weeks of manufactured pressure. And for what? To break someone you decided didn't belong. To eliminate a teammate before she had the chance to prove herself. The room was frozen. Candidates held their breath. The humiliation, the exposure, the collapse, all unfolding in slow, merciless detail. "You thought you were hunting a fraud," Rodriguez continued, his tone colder now. "But you were hunting someone whose file doesn't tell the full story. Someone who's been carrying scars you couldn't imagine. And when the truth comes out, and it will, your names will be remembered, not hers." Mason swallowed hard. "Sir, we—" "Quiet," Rodriguez's voice cut through him like a blade. "Save your excuses for the tribunal. You're done here." The words dropped like hammer blows. Garrett's broad shoulders slumped. Travis stared at the floor, jaw clenched, sweat sliding down his temple. Mason, methodical Mason, looked like he was trying to calculate a way out, but there was none. And all the while, Sloan sat confined to her quarters, unaware of how the tide was shifting. She folded her uniform with the same care she always did, duffel half-packed, her mind a battlefield of quiet memories. She thought of the recorder they had found in her bag, how she had chosen not to fight the accusation, because sometimes denial only fed the wolves. Better to remain silent, better to let the storm rage until the truth showed itself. But in her chest the ache grew sharper, the ache of ghosts she couldn't name aloud, the teammates who had died for her survival, the guilt that clung to her skin like salt water. Her sleeve slid again, the ink flashing for a moment in the dim light. She pressed her fingers over it, the coordinates, the code, the memory. She whispered under her breath, not prayer, not confession, just names, the ones carved into her skin forever. Knock. The door swung open. Commander Hayes stood there, expression unreadable, Dr. Vasquez at his side. Mercer, Hayes said, then softer, Brooks with us. She rose without a word, Duffel still at her side, and followed them down the corridor, past faces that stared, past whispers that buzzed, past the three men whose smirks had curdled into something ugly. Garrett's eyes followed her with disbelief, Mason's with fury, Travis with the hollow stare of a man who had realized too late the cost of his silence. Hayes led her to the briefing room, not to judge her, not to condemn, but to reveal. Inside, Rodriguez waited, the folder still open on the desk. Sloan stood at attention, her gray eyes calm, her silence intact. Hayes didn't waste words. The device in your bag was planted by Mason with Garrett and Keller's support. He let the words hang. We have footage, documentation, it's over. For the first time in weeks, Sloan's eyes flickered. Surprise. No, not quite. Something closer to inevitability. She gave a slow nod. Understood, sir. Rodriguez frowned. That's all, not anger, not relief. Sloan's voice was quiet, even. Some battles I don't waste energy on. Hayes and Vasquez exchanged a look. They knew what that meant. They knew she had been living by that creed long before this training program, long before Garrett's taunts, long before the device. It was the creed of survival. Rodriguez leaned back, studying her. You've endured a lot of silence, more than most would, but understand this, silence won't protect them anymore. They'll answer for what they've done. Sloan nodded again, but her eyes lowered briefly to the tattoo beneath her sleeve. She thought of her teammates, the ones who had silenced their pain with bullets and sacrifice, and she wondered if this was the battle worth fighting, or just another one to walk away from. Hayes's voice cut through her thoughts. There's more, much more. Dr. Vasquez's assessment, the scars, your recovery rates, everything points to one truth. You're not who your file says you are, and now the record must be corrected. Her heart tightened, the past clawed at her ribs. She had hidden so long, survived by silence. Could she survive exposure? Commander, she said softly, with respect, some truths will end more careers than mine. Hayes leaned forward, his voice low, final, and some truths are too heavy to keep buried. The room fell silent again, not the silence of fear, the silence of a storm waiting to break. Outside in the barracks, Garrett sat hunched, his confidence shattered. Travis stared blankly, replaying every insult, every shove, every calculated cruelty that now felt like a noose tightening around his neck. Mason paced like a caged animal, his brilliant sabotage collapsing into a trap of his own making. They had thought they were breaking her. They hadn't realized they were exposing themselves. And Sloan Mercer, Brooks, sat across from commanders and doctors who finally saw through her silence. The woman mocked for her ink, the mechanic written off as weak, the ghost carrying scars no file could hold. The truth was rising, and when it broke the surface, nothing in this program would ever be the same. Because sometimes silence doesn't protect, sometimes silence prepares. And Sloan had been preparing all along. Why did the room fall into a hush when Commander Hayes finally spoke the words aloud? They had gathered in the main briefing hall. Flags framed the walls. Rows of candidates sat rigid, their eyes darting from their instructors to the accused. Garrett, Travis, and Mason stood at the front, stiff and pale, their confidence bled dry. Sloan sat off to the side, alone, her sleeve tugged down over the ink that had started all of this. Hayes's voice was steady, deliberate. We discovered evidence planted in candidate Mercer's gear, fabricated, orchestrated. His gaze burned into the three men. The responsible parties stand before you. Mason's jaw clenched, his lips twitching as if he might argue. Garrett stared straight ahead, his face stone but his hands trembling at his sides. Travis shifted on his feet, every muscle tense. "And there is more," Hayes continued. His tone changed now, softer but heavier. "Much more." The silence thickened. "Candidate Sloan Mercer is not who her file claims. What you mocked, what you dismissed, what you tried to destroy," he stopped, his eyes sweeping the room, letting the weight of the moment press down, "was the record of someone we declared dead." A ripple of disbelief ran through the hall. Heads turned. Murmurs spread like wildfire. Rodriguez stepped forward now, his voice adding gravity. 18 months ago, a classified operation was launched in the Gulf region. Codename Blackbird 77. 12 operators deployed. 12 were lost. At least that's what we believed, until now. Gasp, stunned silence. Dr. Vasquez moved next, setting a folder on the podium. Her words were clinical but piercing. "Medical evidence confirms it. Scars consistent with combat trauma. Surgeries performed in field conditions. Psychological markers of combat stress. Her recovery rates, her endurance, her tactical instincts, all indicators of advanced training, not civilian maintenance work." The room was frozen. Garrett's face drained of blood. Travis's eyes darted to the floor. Mason, methodical Mason, closed his eyes as if the truth itself was too bright to look at. Hayes turned back toward Sloan. His voice dropped lower, almost reverent. "Blackbird 77 declared lost with all hands, except one." And then, for the first time, all eyes shifted to her. Sloan sat still, hands folded in her lap, gaze forward. Not proud, not smug, not even relieved, just steady, just silent. Because what could she say? That she had survived when her brothers hadn't. That she had carried their names in ink because it was the only memorial she was allowed to have. That she had lived every day since, not as a soldier, but as a shadow. Her silence said it all. Rodriguez's voice cut through again. "The tattoo you mocked," he said, his gaze settling coldly on Garrett, "is not decoration. It is coordinates. It is unit designation. It is remembrance. Each mark carries a life, a teammate who did not come home. You laughed at it, you sneered at it, but you were mocking the dead." The words landed like hammer blows. Garrett flinched. Travis's jaw quivered. Mason's hands curled into fists at his sides, but he said nothing. Hayes stepped closer to Sloan now. His voice softened. "We've been searching for you for 18 months. Every intelligence channel, every report. We believed you were gone, and here you are, carrying yourself with silence while surrounded by those too blind to see." For the first time, Sloan's eyes lifted, met his. A flicker of something passed between them, grief, recognition, understanding. Then she spoke, her voice calm, quiet, but carrying across the room. "I didn't survive because I was stronger or smarter. I survived because they bought me that chance. Every breath I take is theirs. Every mile I run, every scar I wear. Their legacy, not mine." No one moved, no one breathed. Even Garrett, who had mocked her most, seemed to shrink under the weight of her words. Dr. Vasquez closed the folder. "Her presence here is no accident. Her survival is proof that strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides, sometimes it waits." Rodriguez stepped forward once more. "And sometimes," he said sharply, "it is tested by those unworthy of its company." His eyes locked onto Garrett, Travis, and Mason. "You three will face consequences, severe ones. Court-martial proceedings begin immediately. Harassment, fabrication of evidence, conduct unbecoming. You've disgraced this program and you've disgraced yourselves." Garrett swallowed, finally speaking. "We didn't know," his voice cracked, desperate. "We didn't know who she was." Hayes's glare burned through him. "You didn't need to know. Respect should not depend on knowing the file. You treat every teammate as if their story is greater than yours, because sometimes it is. and sometimes it's classified. Garrett's shoulders sagged, his arrogance crumbling. Travis shifted uncomfortably, his silence heavy with shame. Mason looked hollow, his mind already running the numbers, realizing no calculation could save him now. And Sloan, she remained silent, because for her this wasn't victory, this wasn't justice. It was just truth, a truth too late to save her teammates, too heavy to celebrate. The briefing ended in silence. Candidates dismissed, whispers swirling in their wake. Garrett, Travis, and Mason were escorted out, their futures sealed. Their legacy in this place wasn't strength or skill, it was shame. Sloan lingered in her seat, the hall emptying around her. Hayes approached slowly. "You've carried this weight too long," he said softly, "but you don't have to carry it alone anymore." Her eyes remained forward, her voice low. "That's the thing about ghosts, sir. They don't share the load, they just follow." Hayes didn't answer. There was nothing to say. Dr. Vasquez touched Sloane's shoulder gently before leaving. "You're not broken," she whispered. "You're proof." And then Sloane was alone. Alone in a room where her truth had finally been spoken aloud, where the ink on her wrist no longer needed to be hidden, where the silence had finally cracked, just enough for others to hear what it had been holding all along. But she didn't feel lighter. She felt the weight of 12 names pressing harder, because now everyone knew, and knowing didn't make it easier. Outside, the sun fell low across the facility grounds, shadows stretching long across the sand. The same sand she had once bled into, the same sun she had once thought she'd never see again. She pulled her sleeve back down, covering the tattoo once more. Some marks were too heavy to leave exposed. And as the night settled in, Sloane realized this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. Because now that her silence was broken, the world would demand more. More answers, more truths, more of the story she had fought to keep buried. And she wasn't sure she was ready. Not yet. But the ghosts never asked permission, they just followed. And she knew they were with her still. Why did she always flinch just slightly when helicopters passed overhead at night? No one at the facility noticed. Not really. To most, it was just background noise, blades chopping through salt air, routine training flights in the distance. But to Sloane, every sound was memory. Every vibration was a pull back into sand and fire. That night, alone in her quarters, she finally let herself remember. 18 months ago, Gulf region, Blackbird 77. 12 operators moving under moonless sky. No names, just call signs, just the mission. She could still feel the desert air, thick with tension and silence. The operation had been designed as a surgical strike, slip in, extract intelligence assets, slip out. Clean, precise, invisible. But it hadn't been clean. Not even close. The first contact came hours in. Ambush. Coordinated, too sharp to be coincidence. They'd been waiting for them. She could still hear the first burst of fire, the radio crackle, the shout, "Contact left." Chaos followed. Sloane remembered the heat of the sand against her cheek as she hit the ground, the taste of dust in her mouth, the scream of a teammate cut short. She remembered returning fire, movements automatic, training flowing through her muscles even as her heart hammered like a trapped bird. They should have pulled back, but the extraction route was already compromised. The fallback point was 20 clicks east, and every step was contested. For 3 days they fought, running battles in narrow wadis, exchanges of fire in crumbling villages. Every hour, fewer voices on the comms. Every hour, more silence filling the channels where her team had once breathed life. She remembered Sergeant Clarke, who'd carried extra ammo for her when her pack had been hit by shrapnel. Clarke, who'd taken a round through the chest but stayed upright until they made cover. She remembered the way his breathing grew shallow, the way he pressed his hand against her wrist, muttering, "Get out. Don't waste it." She remembered Rivera, their comms specialist, setting up the last desperate transmission. Fingers bleeding, voice hoarse, sending coordinates again and again into the void, knowing no one was coming. She remembered each one, each face, each fall. And she remembered the moment she was separated. They'd been moving toward the final extraction point, a dry riverbed, shallow, winding. Fire came from both sides. They scattered, voices shouting in the night. She'd been pushed down into cover, her weapon almost torn from her grip. And when she looked up again, the world was fire and chaos. Her unit ahead, herself alone. She had waited for the signal, waited for the voices to return. But they never did. The desert went silent. When friendly forces found her days later, she was half-conscious, bleeding, clutching a drive against her chest. The intelligence they had been sent for. The one thing she had refused to drop. 12 deployed, 1 recovered. And when she woke in a secure facility weeks later, they told her the truth. Blackbird 77 was gone, declared lost, classified as a mission that never officially existed. Her survival was a complication, a risk. So they gave her a choice: disappear under a new identity or become a liability. She chose disappearance. The scars on her shoulder came from that night, the ache in her leg from the shrapnel that still lingered, the tattoo, her only memorial, etched in ink because official gravestones were denied them, coordinates, unit, lives condensed into symbols on her skin. Now, sitting in her quarters months later, those memories pressed down like stone. The facility slept, but Sloan stayed awake, silent, breathing steady, eyes fixed on the ceiling as names whispered in her head. Clarke, Rivera, Mitchell, Stone, all of them, each one she'd carried, each one who had bought her another breath. Knock. The door opened. Dr. Vasquez stepped in, soft-voiced. Couldn't sleep. Sloan didn't answer. Vasquez closed the door, set a file on the small desk. I've seen enough soldiers to know the look. You carry ghosts, and they're heavy. Sloan's eyes flicked to the folder. You've read it all. Not all, Vasquez said gently. Enough. She sat across from her, studying her face. You think silence honors them, that if you don't speak you carry their burden. But silence doesn't erase the pain, it only buries it deeper. Sloan's jaw clenched. Talking won't bring them back. No, Vasquez said softly, but it might bring you back. For the first time, Sloan's composure cracked, just slightly, a flicker of grief in her eyes, a whisper barely audible. They didn't die clean. Vasquez leaned forward. Tell me. And so Sloan did, not the whole story, not every detail, but enough. The ambush, the running battles, the separation, the silence afterward. Her voice carried no tears, no theatrics, just facts. Each word clipped, each sentence like a report filed against her own soul. When she finished, Vasquez's eyes glistened. She reached across, resting her hand lightly on Sloan's wrist. You survived. That doesn't make you guilty, it makes you responsible, and that's not the same thing. But Sloan pulled her wrist back, tugging the sleeve down again. Responsibility feels the same as guilt when you're the only one left. Vasquez didn't argue, she knew better. The next morning, the facility buzzed with rumors. Candidates whispered about Blackbird 77, about the revelation Hayes had delivered. Some stared at Sloan with awe, others with confusion, some with shame, remembering how they had stood by while Garrett, Travis, and Mason had torn her down. But Sloan walked through it all the same way. She always had quiet, steady sleeve covering her wrist, eyes forward. Meanwhile, in a separate wing, Garrett, Travis, and Mason faced questioning. What were you thinking? Rodriguez's voice cracked like a whip. Planting evidence, targeting a teammate. Harassment isn't just misconduct, it's betrayal. You undermine trust in a program that depends on it. Garrett tried to hold his ground, voice low. We didn't know who she was. That's the point, Rodriguez barked. You don't need to know, you don't mock, you don't sabotage, you don't decide who belongs. Travis's silence said more than words. His arms shook slightly, his mask of quiet menace crumbling under the weight of exposure. Mason tried reason, tried to explain, tried to weave words into excuses, but none of it mattered. The evidence was clear. Their fates were sealed. And Sloan, she didn't ask what was happening to them. She didn't need to know. Her silence was its own kind of judgment. That evening, Hayes called her into his office again. He stood at the window, watching the training grounds glow under floodlights. His voice was low when he spoke. "You could walk away," he said. "Disappear again. The Navy would honor it. No one would blame you." Sloan stood straight, her duffel at her side. "And if I stay?" "Then you'll have to step into the light," Hayes said. "Your name, your story, no more silence." Her breath caught. The thought of exposure felt heavier than any pack she'd carried, but behind it a flicker of something else. Not relief, not pride, something like purpose. She whispered, almost to herself, "Maybe it's time their names were spoken again." Hayes nodded slowly. "Then let's start." And for the first time, Sloan felt the possibility that her silence, the silence that had protected her, defined her, nearly broken her, might finally become a voice. Not for herself, but for them. The ones she carried in ink, the ones she carried in scars, the ones who followed her still. Why did the room feel colder when the tribunal began? It wasn't the air conditioning. It wasn't the metal chairs lined in neat, unforgiving rows. It was the weight of judgment pressing down, of reputations shattering before they even had the chance to stand. Garrett, Mason, and Travis sat at the front, side by side, their uniforms still neat, their faces pale. Each one wore a different mask. Garrett looked stubborn, jaw tight, though his eyes betrayed the tremble beneath. Mason stared forward like a chess player who had run out of moves. Travis, the quiet shadow, shifted restlessly, his silence now heavy with shame. Across from them sat the panel, Rodriguez, Hayes, and two senior officers flown in after the scandal broke. Dr. Vasquez observed from the side, file in her lap, eyes sharp. And in the back, Sloan. She hadn't asked to be there. She hadn't volunteered to watch men who had tormented her unravel under questioning. But Hayes had insisted. Sometimes silence isn't enough, he'd told her. Sometimes the truth needs a witness. So she sat there, still straight-backed, silent. The proceedings began. Rodriguez's voice carried across the room, firm and clipped. "Candidates Garrett, Mason, and Keller," he said, using Travis's last name, "you stand accused of harassment, falsification of evidence, conduct unbecoming. Do you understand the charges?" Garrett gave a stiff nod. Mason said nothing. Travis whispered, "Yes, sir." The panel began with evidence. The security footage played on a screen, Mason crouched by Sloan's gear, slipping the recorder inside. The grainy angles, the incriminating frame-by-frame detail. Garrett's mocking words recorded by dorm microphones, Travis's complicit silence caught in the background. Each second was a nail in their coffin. Rodriguez's questions were merciless. Why target her? Why decide she didn't belong? Garrett finally spoke, voice strained. "She didn't act like the rest of us. She was different, too quiet, too precise. We thought," his words faltered, "we thought she was pretending." "Pretending," Hayes's voice cut in sharp. "You mocked someone you didn't understand. You humiliated a teammate for carrying scars you couldn't see. You sabotaged her for being stronger than you could accept." Garrett's face flushed red, his lips pressed together. No answer came. Travis's turn came next. He looked up once, met Rodriguez's eyes, then lowered his gaze again. "I followed," he admitted quietly. "Didn't stop it, didn't speak. I let it happen." That silence was worse than denial. A confession that weakness had chained him, that cowardice had made him complicit. And then Mason. He leaned forward, his voice cool, logical, almost detached. "We acted based on what we knew. A recruit with no record performing at a level that didn't make sense. It was suspicious, and suspicion breeds action." Rodriguez slammed a hand against the table. "Action? You call planting evidence action. You call destroying someone's career action. That's not action, that's betrayal. Mason's mask cracked for just a second. His lips tightened. His composure frayed, but he still said nothing. And then Hayes spoke. His words were quieter but heavier. You didn't just target a recruit. You mocked the dead. That tattoo you sneered at, those marks you laughed at, they're the names of fallen operators. Soldiers who bled so you could sit in this room and wear that uniform. You spat on them, and you spat on her. The silence that followed was suffocating. Every candidate in the room felt it. The shame, the echo of respect they hadn't given, the weight of mocking something they hadn't understood. Finally, the panel turned to Sloan. She hadn't wanted this. She hadn't wanted to speak. But when Rodriguez asked Candidate Mercer, "Do you wish to testify?" she stood. Her steps to the front were measured. Her sleeve, as always, covered the ink. She stood facing the panel, her voice steady. "I don't need justice," she said. "Not for me. What was done to me isn't new. Soldiers get broken in different ways, some by fire, some by silence, some by cruelty." Her eyes flicked toward Garrett Mason Travis. "You asked why I was different, why I didn't break. The truth is I already broke, 18 months ago, on a mission that took every name but mine. Blackbird 77. Murmur stirred, but she continued. 12 operators, only one walked out. I didn't earn survival, I inherited it. Every scar you mocked, every silence you sneered at was bought by them. And that tattoo." Slowly, deliberately, she tugged her sleeve up. For the first time in public, the ink caught the light. Coordinates, numbers, marks etched deep into skin. "These aren't decorations, they're graves. Every line is a man who didn't come home. Every number is a memory I carry because no one else can. When you laughed, you weren't laughing at me. You were laughing at them." Her voice broke just slightly, just enough. Then it steadied again. "So no, I don't want justice for me, but I want you to remember their names. I want you to carry the shame of mocking ghosts who gave everything so you could stand here and feel superior." The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one breathed. Garrett's eyes glistened. His arrogance dissolved into something smaller, almost human. Travis lowered his head into his hands, his body shaking with quiet sobs he didn't want anyone to hear. Mason's jaw clenched, his stare fixed on the floor, his mask crumbling but not shattered. Hayes's voice filled the room, softer now, reflective. "Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts, and she has carried more dignity in silence than you three ever carried in arrogance." Rodriguez delivered the verdict. "You are dismissed from this program, effective immediately. Tribunal recommendations will ensure your actions follow you wherever you try to serve. You dishonored this uniform, and you will not wear it again." The words fell like final blows. Garrett bowed his head, broken. Travis nodded silently, tears streaking his face. Mason stood tall, but his silence wasn't strength anymore. It was defeat. They were let out, footsteps echoing like the closing of a chapter. And Sloan, she pulled her sleeve back down, returning to her seat without expression. Not triumphant, not vindicated, just steady, just silent. Because for her, this wasn't about them. It was about the ghosts. That night Hayes found her again. Alone, outside by the water's edge, the moon silver on the waves. "You spoke," he said. "After all this time, you let them hear." Sloane's eyes stayed on the horizon. "Not for me." Hayes nodded slowly. "For them." Her voice softened, almost a whisper. "Always for them." And the silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was full, full of memory, full of names, full of a quiet kind of dignity that didn't need applause to matter. Why did the facility feel different once the three were gone? The hallways were the same. The cadence of boots still echoed against concrete. The smell of oil, salt, and sweat lingered as always, but there was something new in the air. Respect. Uneasy. Quiet. The kind that couldn't be demanded, only earned. For weeks Sloan had walked those same halls invisible, mocked, tested, cornered. Now every step she took was watched, not with ridicule, not with suspicion, but with something else: curiosity, reverence, shame. Some candidates nodded at her now, the kind of nod given to someone who has endured more than the uniform itself demands. Some lowered their eyes, guilty for the times they hadn't spoken up. Others lingered, as if they wanted to ask questions but didn't dare. Sloan gave them nothing: no speeches, no explanations, just silence. Hayes and Rodriguez watched closely. They understood that silence better now. It wasn't defiance, it wasn't pride, it was survival. But Dr. Vasquez saw deeper. She pulled Sloan aside one evening, into the quiet of the infirmary where the hum of lights drowned the world outside. "You carry yourself like a soldier still in battle," Vasquez said softly. Sloan folded her arms. "Aren't we all?" Vasquez tilted her head. "Not like you. You walk as if ghosts are at your shoulders. You hide them under sleeves and silence, but they don't go away." Sloan looked at her, eyes steady but tired. "And what do you suggest, doctor? That I bleed them out in words? That I tell my story until it feels lighter? It doesn't get lighter, it just spreads." Vasquez studied her. Then gently: "Maybe spreading it is the point. Maybe carrying it alone isn't the way you honor them. Maybe sharing it is." Sloan didn't answer. Couldn't. She just tugged her sleeve down again, the ink hidden once more. The days blurred into training again. Obstacle courses, live fire drills, conditioning runs under the burning sun. Sloan moved through each with the same quiet determination, not leading, not lagging, just steady, always steady. But there was one difference now: no one mocked her. Instructors watched her with sharper eyes, respect mixing with caution. Candidates whispered about her when they thought she couldn't hear. Some still doubted, others envied, but no one dared sneer, not anymore. Garrett, Mason, and Travis were gone, but their absence lingered like a warning. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Hayes called Sloan into his office. He poured 2 cups of coffee, slid one across to her. His voice was quiet. "You don't have to stay." She looked at him. He continued: "You've proven more than enough. If you want to walk away, disappear again, you can. The Navy won't stop you. The silence you've lived in, you could choose to return to it." Her fingers traced the rim of the cup. "And if I stay?" Hayes leaned back, his gaze heavy. "Then you step into the light. No more hiding. No more ghosts in the file. Your name restored. Your story told." Sloan stared into the dark coffee. The thought of exposure still twisted inside her. She didn't want glory. She didn't want recognition. She didn't want her survival turned into speeches or symbols. But she thought of Clarke, Rivera, Mitchell, Stone, all the names etched into her wrist, all the voices silenced in the desert. She whispered, more to herself than to him, "Maybe it's time their names were spoken again." Hayes nodded. "Then let's speak them." The next day, during a rare assembly, Hayes took the podium. He spoke of integrity, of sacrifice, of the weight of silence and the power of truth. And then he did something no one expected. He gestured to Sloan. She didn't want to walk forward. Every muscle resisted, but her legs carried her anyway. She stood before rows of faces, before the weight of eyes that had once dismissed her, and she let her silence finally break. "I am not Sloan Mercer," she said quietly. "My name is Brooks, operator Blackbird 77. The murmurs rippled through the crowd, but she pressed on. 12 of us went in. Only one came out. I carry their names because no one else will. I carry their ghosts because no one else can. I don't stand here to be honored. I stand here so you remember survival isn't strength. Survival is responsibility. It is debt, and it never ends." Her sleeve slid up. The ink glistened in the harsh lights. Coordinates, numbers, etched scars of memory. "These aren't decorations. They are graves, and I wear them so they will not be forgotten." Silence filled the hall. Not mocking silence, not skeptical silence, reverent silence. Some lowered their heads, some blinked back tears, some straightened their shoulders as if reminded of what the uniform truly meant. And Sloan Brooks pulled her sleeve back down. She turned from the podium and walked away. No applause followed, no cheering, just silence. The kind of silence that carried weight, the kind that honored the dead. Later that night, she sat by the water's edge, the moon reflected in dark waves. Hayes approached quietly but didn't speak at first. Finally, he said, "You gave them more than words, you gave them dignity." Her voice was soft. Dignity doesn't need words, it doesn't shout, it doesn't demand, it simply acts. Hayes nodded, then left her to the waves. She stayed there a long time, the sea wind brushing against her face, the names whispering in her head. Clarke, Rivera, Mitchell, Stone. And for the first time in a long time, the silence around her didn't feel like a prison. It felt like company. Because sometimes ghosts don't haunt. Sometimes they guard. And she knew as she watched the horizon blur into darkness that she would keep walking, not as Sloan Mercer, not as the silent recruit mocked for her ink, but as Brooks, survivor, witness, carrier of names. Her journey wasn't over. It never would be, but she would carry it with dignity, quiet, steady, unbroken. And the moral whispered itself, like the tide against the shore. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.